All right, guys. So I don't know really how to start this, but this will be a podcast about the Battle of Midway, and I was going to talk about some other stuff before in Civic War before Midway, leading up to that, and I just wanted to start out because I know I haven't done this in like forever, so I'm sorry about that. I just wanted to say hey, how y'all doing? Good luck with college. Don't die of coronavirus. I will actually be headed home soon, because of the coronavirus. They canceled classes, so I'm doing that from home. So I would get to see maybe some of y'all back in North Bend. That would be cool. But personal updates before I started this podcast. I wanted to talk about, in case you're wondering how college is going for me, it's going really well. I'm enjoying it. It's the first time in my life I've had straight A's. I'm going to be honest. Um, and having a fun time just studying history. That's you guys knew that's what I was going to be doing. Um, but yeah, it's been good. Have a girlfriend. She makes me really happy. I love her more than anything. Um, and y'all probably know who that is, but I don't really want to share that right now yet. Um, and I think that's about it. She was the idea for getting back on the podcast. Was I was just talking to her last night about history, and she knew about the podcast, so she said you should do that again. And so here I am. And what today I wanted to talk about, now that that's out of the way, is the Pacific War in World War II, specifically the Battle of Midway. And I just want to be sure because I haven't been citing anything in previous podcasts, so I wanted to make sure that I actually start citing some sources for what I'm talking about. This is the book where like 90% or 100% of what I will be talking about comes from. It's called Battle of Midway by Craig L. Simons. I won't be quoting it verbatim because I just finished it like a week ago, so I don't really remember all the specifics. But he's a pretty good naval historian, really well regarded, really well known. And so yeah, so I wanted to just get into that. Um, so as you know, World War II for the U.S. started in 1941, December 7th, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. When they did that, it obviously was a shock, surprise to America, and it had not been planned for by America. America had plans for invasions of the Philippines or British possessions, but they had not planned to be attacked at Pearl Harbor. Though you could say it was a pretty big surprise for the Americans, and there was really they were on the defensive for the first 6 months of the war, for sure. They conducted some raids in the Marshall Islands, some of the different American aircraft carriers. Small things, didn't really do much to change the overall war at all. But they did that. They conducted the Doolittle raid against Tokyo, which was kind of a one and done deal. It was really for morale boosting, didn't damage Japanese industry or anything. And then later on, the Battle of the Coral Sea would be the first major battle of the Pacific War. It'd be the first battle between aircraft carriers in world history. One of the first, or the first battle where neither opposing naval force would actually visually see the other. So a lot of landmarks there. And since it was the first in many of these aspects, it was not really a disaster on both sides, but neither side really knew what they were doing. It turned out being really awkward for both commanders. Frank Jack Fletcher of the American fleet and Chuichi Nagumo. Or no, yeah, I believe it was Chuichi Nagumo. Don't quote me on that. He did command. He led the attack on Pearl Harbor and Midway, and I believe he was the commanding officer during the Battle of the Coral Sea. But don't quote me on that. So Battle of the Coral Sea basically was spurred by the Japanese wanting to invade Port Moresby on Papua New Guinea, to sever the Allied connection from Australia to Hawaii, and that ended up not really going super well for the Japanese because the covering task force of carriers was engaged by the U.S. carriers, the USS Yorktown and the USS Lexington, under the command of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. The USS Lexington, which could carry about 110 aircraft, was sunk. The Japanese light carrier Shoho, which could only carry about 20 aircraft, was sunk. So obviously a pretty big disparity there. The Americans lost a much larger ship, but the Japanese withdrew after the battle, sustaining damage to their two heavy carriers, the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, which could carry about 70 planes each. And that basically threw off their whole invasion plan they never invaded Papua New Guinea, and the connection remained there between Hawaii and Australia. So that spurred the Battle of Midway, which was the brainchild of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who also was the brainchild of the Pearl Harbor attack. He actually threatened to resign if the Imperial Japanese Naval High Command didn't accept his Pearl Harbor plan, and obviously since he was a very prestigious admiral, that meant a lot if he was going to resign. So they let him carry out the Pearl Harbor plan reluctantly in some cases. And then Midway was another one. It was a very hard sell to the Japanese High Command. It's very far from Japan, so it's very hard to supply if you invade it, which is what Yamamoto wanted to do. He sold it eventually to the Japanese High Command in the same way that he sold Pearl Harbor to them, as in he threatened to resign if he didn't get his way. Japanese High Command gave way to him, said, yeah, they green-lighted his idea. And at that point, once again, Shuichi Nagumo was put in command of what's known as the Kido Butai, which translates directly to strike or mobile force, but it's an allusion to the mobile strike force of the Japanese carriers. That's the same force that attacked Pearl Harbor with 6 aircraft carriers, except the Shokaku and Zuikaku had been damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea, so they sat this battle out, and only the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu would participate in the Battle of Midway on the Japanese side, once again under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Once again, the Americans would be under the command of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the USS Enterprise and Hornet, operating as one task force, Task Force 16, and the USS Yorktown, operating on its own as Task Force 17. And I want to emphasize, whenever I say these ships are operating, this means these are just the aircraft carriers. They have several destroyers and cruisers around them, screening ships that provide anti-air fire and can keep the ships safe from submarines, or keep the carriers safe from submarine attacks. And so they were operating as 2 separate task forces, which highlights the distinction between Japanese and American carrier doctrine, as in the Americans operated usually with one carrier at the center of a group of ships, cruisers and destroyers in the early part of the war. Later on, that would expand to include battleships, would be part of these task forces. And the Japanese, on the other hand, would concentrate all of their ships into one large force, which has its benefits and has its disadvantages as well. The idea on the Japanese side is that you can have all of your ships concentrate their firepower on another ship, therefore making it easier to sink that ship. If you have everybody focused on that one ship, whereas it's a lot harder to sink an enemy ship with only one carrier worth of planes. But the Americans, obviously, they operated differently because the idea was each carrier could do its own thing, and that gives you more flexibility as a force with which to operate. And so again, they have their advantages and disadvantages each. In the Battle of Midway, this would actually play a big part. The carrier doctrine would play a large role in how the battle would develop, because, well, we'll get into it later. But that basically sets the stage. You know who the major players are. The force, you have 3 American aircraft carriers to 4 Japanese, but the U.S. also have the island of Midway, which has an airfield. So 4 airplane platforms, the 3 carriers in an island, to 4 carriers, airplane platforms. And the Japanese idea was that they'd attack Midway to draw out the American carriers, who they believed would be in Pearl Harbor at the time. And when they steamed out from Pearl Harbor, they could ambush them with submarines on the way. While they were traveling to Midway, they'd be ambushed by Japanese submarines. And then the Japanese carriers could finish them off from there. And potentially they could also use surface ships, such as battleships, to sink the carriers, whatever remained of them. That's the Japanese plan in a nutshell. And then obviously they'd invade the island afterwards. A big part of this hinged on the idea was that they were going to sink the American carriers because that's what they wanted to do. They'd been thorn in the side at Coral Sea. The Doolittle raid was possible because of American carriers, and so Yamamoto wanted to put them away. The unfortunate part for Yamamoto is the Americans knew the Japanese code. They were able to determine what exactly the Japanese were going to do, or roughly what the Japanese were going to do, anticipated where the Japanese would come from, or well, like they kind of knew because of the codes, and then they'd position themselves strategically to intercept the Japanese carrier force. As a result, the the U.S. aircraft carriers got out to Midway before the Japanese could set up their submarines between Pearl Harbor and Midway, and that resulted in the submarines basically played no role in the battle, almost no role whatsoever. Um, Later on the morning of June 4th, 1942, there was a strike force sent out from the Japanese carriers to attack Midway Island. Um, Attacked the island, but did not destroy the airfield. Destroyed a lot of the aircraft, while American fighter aircraft from Midway, leaving it not totally defenseless, but um, for the most part defenseless. And the Japanese at this point had no idea the American carriers were stationed about 325 miles northeast of Midway, and the Japanese were somewhere to the northwest of Midway, also about 400 miles away. The Americans then launched their own attacks on Japanese carriers from Midway Island, very, very much largely unsuccessful. Um, and a lot of the aircraft were just shot down with no effect at all. The Americans also launched their air raids from the carriers a little bit after that happened. The Americans at this point were using very outdated, antiquated torpedo planes, which were very slow. Their torpedoes at this point in the war were very unreliable, so even if you could get a torpedo off at a Japanese ship, the likelihood of it actually being effective at all was very low. And this was unfortunate for the Americans because of the American aircraft. The first to get out there were the torpedo planes. They were pretty much slaughtered wholesale, which is very unfortunate. And the Hornets air group actually flew off to the north and had almost no part in the battle except for their torpedo planes, which were killed to the man, save one guy. The Japanese also destroyed USS Enterprise's torpedo squadron, and for the most part destroyed the Yorktown's torpedo squadron, which both arrived at the same time, the Enterprise and Yorktown, a little bit after the Hornets torpedo squadron. The bomber squadron, from Hornet flew well away from the Japanese carriers because they didn't know where they were. And they were also very combat inexperienced. This was the Hornet's first combat mission, aside from the Doolittle raid, which was carried out almost exclusively by Army aviators. So the aviators from Hornet were pretty much, this was their first experience in battle. The Enterprise and Yorktown, on the contrary, were obviously the Yorktown was a veteran of Coral Sea, so they very much knew what they were doing, and the Enterprise was a veteran of Marshall Islands raids in very early 1942. So they had some experience in combat operations. That was pretty good for them because the Enterprise dive bomber squadrons arrived once all the Japanese fighters had to go down low to get the torpedo planes, and all the anti-aircraft guns were trained low across the water to take out torpedo planes. And when the dive bombers came down from about 20,000 feet, they came in relatively unopposed from the Enterprise, and also dive bombers from the Yorktown arrived very, very shortly thereafter, and they were able to sink 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers outright. The Soryu being the only one, the Hiryu being the only one that survived. This initial confrontation, anyways. And in large part, like, aircraft carriers usually don't get sunk by bombs only. It's usually a combination of torpedoes and bombs. Torpedoes are better ship-killing weapons, but the Japanese had very shoddy ammunition storage practices at this time, or their Navy did, and also storing fuel lines and whatnot. They did not do that very well. Their damage control units were not emphasized at all. And so when these bombs hit, it detonated aviation fuel, torpedoes, bombs, anything you can imagine that's explosive that would be on a ship was detonated. And so the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu were all set ablaze, and more or less they were put out of action or sunk outright. And I believe all 3 of them eventually sunk due to this bombing. These planes returned to their carriers. A lot of the Japanese planes that were aloft only had one carrier to return to, um, and that was the Hiryu, which was overloaded. The Hiryu would later be able to send out a strike force against the Yorktown, but at this point in the battle, a strike force from the other three ships, which had just been sunk, was already en route to the Americans. They were able to beat up the Yorktown pretty badly, but the Americans had to emphasize damage control a lot more than the Japanese Navy did. So they stored fuel lines, they pushed over an auxiliary fuel tank over the side of the ship to keep it from exploding when they were attacked. And they purged the fuel lines of any fuel or oil, and stored those. And like I said, they stored ammunition, so it wasn't just laying around the hangar deck. They were banged up pretty badly. There was a hole blown in the flight deck, meaning that they could not recover aircraft. That was patched up fairly quickly, and the Yorktown was badly damaged, but it could still, for the most part, launch and recover aircraft. Later on, a strike force from the Hiryu would not finish off the Yorktown, but they'd put some torpedoes in the Yorktown, putting her at like a 25, I believe, degree list, so she could not launch or recover aircraft, because obviously if the deck is sideways, you can't land on that. And the reason that they'd attacked the Yorktown, because the Japanese knew that there were two other carriers operating in the vicinity, but they attacked the Yorktown because the damage control parties had done such a good job of patching the deck and making it look operational, that the Japanese believed it to be an entirely different aircraft carrier. So they expended torpedoes that they really didn't have. They didn't need to on the Yorktown. And at this point, she still wasn't sunk, but she was again very, very badly damaged. Any of her aircraft that were airborne had to land on the Enterprise and the Hornet. And using a combined strike force of the Hornet's aircraft on the Enterprise plus the Enterprise zone aircraft, they were able to launch another strike force, which eventually put the Hiryu out of commission, blowing out about half of the flight deck of the Hiryu, which was later scuttled by the Japanese because it was so far gone as to be unusable. So the next day it was scuttled by the Japanese. But at this point, the battle was pretty much over for the most part. The Americans would sink two cruisers on June 6th, I believe. Maybe it was June 5th. Again, don't quote me on that. But as for the carrier warfare, that was about it. The Yorktown was put under tow to be taken back to Hawaii to be repaired when it was struck by one of the Japanese submarines, which had been stationed between Hawaii and Midway. I believe the I-168. Again, don't quote me on that. Might have been the I-68. But yeah, so it was eventually sunk. The Americans lost an aircraft carrier, but they could replace those losses. They put 24 more aircraft carriers out before the war's end. The Japanese could not sustain those losses. It's not just the carriers, but the men, the airplanes. They could not afford to replace. It was because they just didn't have the materials. They didn't have the industry. Their training programs for pilots were so very selective that they chose way fewer people than the Americans. The Americans tried to train 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 at a time, whereas the Japanese would train literally 4 to 8 at a time. Plus, they literally hand built their aircraft. Like, one person would be in charge of almost building an entire aircraft on their own, or a few people would be in charge. Whereas the Americans would literally put them on assembly lines and turn out hundreds of thousands of them. And so the losses sustained by the Japanese at Midway were not only far greater than the American losses, but they couldn't be replaced, whereas the American ones could. And the Japanese would never again be on the offensive in the Pacific theater because of their losses at Midway. And to use a phrase that I used yesterday, the Japanese really just kind of got milly rocked by the Americans at Midway. And that just, I don't know, that's pretty much all there is to it. But I'm going to end it there. It was probably very long-winded, but hopefully you got the gist. Again, if you find more interest in this, read this book. It's a very good book. It's also covered briefly in another one of Craig L. Simon's books I have, called World War II at Sea, which chronicles all of the navies. The Italians, the Germans, the Americans, the Japanese, and the British are all covered in detail in that book. It's a very good book. I would recommend all of his work if you're interested in history. And yeah, sorry if that was a little bit confusing, anything I said, but yeah, that's all there is to it. And I'm thinking about starting up the podcast again. If you guys want it, let me know. If you don't, then I guess don't comment. But if you guys want to hear about any other kind of history, ancient history or anything, or even if it's not history, if you want to talk politics or anything else, leave it in the comments. I'll try to do the best I can. If it's something I can talk about, I will make an episode about it. I'm pretty busy right now with classes, but I'll try to make an episode about it if you really want me to. Um, if you don't, then I guess don't comment. Um, and if I don't have enough information about it to make an informed episode about it, then I'll try to read up as much as I can on it to offer some insight into it. But like I said, just hit me up if you guys want to, um, if you guys want to chat ever, or if you just have any suggestions or ideas, things you want to hear about for a podcast episode. Tell me what I did good, what I did bad about this, if you'd like a different organizational structure, or what you would like, because I'm pretty new to this. But yeah, I guess enjoy your day. Have a good time and go Cats.